Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Good to be home after working on the mixing stage all day. Thought this would be a very appropriate t-shirt. Who gets it? Who gets the reference? I know there's some people out there my age. Who gets it? I'm sure most of you do. You'll let us know. Okay. Who's in the house? Joe in the Inland Empire, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Mickey. Now that you are broadcasting, my day is complete. You're so sweet. Thank you, Mickey. Marjorie in Georgia, Ella in the house. Did I get it? Okay. Very good. Our daf today is page 48 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 4. We've been getting into the nuances of when a transaction is actually finalized. As we've seen over and over again, that when something is purchased for money in an exchange, in a transaction between two Jews, and we'll see it's different when it's a transaction between a Jew and a Gentile, but between two Jews, even if the money has changed hands, the deal has not been finalized. Only when the purchaser takes possession of the thing that he is purchasing. When he pulls the item, picks up the item, they make a symbolic exchange over the real property that's being purchased. Only then has the deal been effected. The mere changing hands of the money is not enough to do that. And as we've seen, that is a protection for the buyer. This is by rabbinic decree that the seller is going to be responsible for the produce, for the product, for the commodity until it actually leaves his possession. And this is so that he won't say, oh, there was a fire in the upper story. Sorry, your stuff got burned up. He will be motivated to protect it because it is still his property until the purchaser actually receives it. And there's other nuances that now when we're talking about money does not affect acquisition, changing hands, changing possession of the actual property does. This is going to have implications in other areas of the law. We picked this up a few lines from the top on page 48a. No one gets the t-shirt? You don't see what this is a reference to? It's a movie. Okay. Rava says a verse and a baraisa support the opinion of Reish Lakish that money does not affect acquisition of movable property by Torah law. A verse, as it is written, quote, and deal falsely with his colleague in a matter of deposit or of pledge or of robbery, or oppressed his colleague, Leviticus 5:21. And the verse is referring to cases similar to a deposit where there is a denial of an item and not merely a debt. So with regard to the term pledge, Rav Chisda says this is referring to a case where the debtor designated a vessel as collateral for his loan, and then he denies that he ever borrowed the money. Now, with regard to the term oppressed, Rav Chisda says this is referring to a case where the employer designated a vessel for him to guarantee payment of his wages, and then he withheld payment, resulting in oppression of the employee. And when the verse repeats 3 of these cases after stating that each individual admitted that he lied and is liable to return the item that he misappropriated, it is written, and then it shall be, if he has sinned and is guilty, that he shall restore that which he took by robbery, or the thing that he has gotten by oppression, or the deposit that was deposited with him. That's Leviticus 5:23. While the verse does not repeat the term pledge. And what is the reason that the verse does not repeat the term pledge? What is the reason that the verse omits that case? While the verse does not repeat while the verse does not repeat the term pledge, right? These two verses are compared to each other, Leviticus 5:21 and 5:23, which has a lot of the same language, but the term pledge is not used in this second verse. And what is the reason that the verse omits that case? Is it not because it lacks pulling by the lender? Since the lender did not pull the item designated as collateral for the loan, he did not acquire the item, and he is not liable to bring an offering for taking a false oath if he fails to pay, as he denied owing an abstract debt, not an actual item. So apparently there is no full-fledged acquisition without pulling the item into one's possession, right? Just the mere fact that it was deposited in my house or on my property, or that you say I took it but I didn't take it, there was no witnesses, you offered it to me, all those things do not create a change in possession, an acquisition of the object, right? There has to be a kinyan, a formal act of acquisition that witnesses can see. Rav Papa said to Rava, say that it suffices that the verse repeated the case of oppression. In that case, there's also no denial of an actual item, merely an obligation to pay one's worker. And the law would be the same in the case of a pledge, i.e. of a loan where the lender designated an item, although there was no pulling. And the Gemara rejects that contention. With what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the workers took the item for their payment from the employer and then deposited that item with him, and the employer then denied having received that deposit. So accordingly, he is denying owing an actual item, not an abstract debt, right? It's like the workers did the job. The guy who hired them wouldn't pay, so they took some of the equipment from the job site. So then the guy said, all right, I will pay you. You can give me the equipment back. They said, this is our equipment until you pay us, but okay, you can hold on to it, and it will become yours again once you actually pay us. And then this guy, once he got his equipment back, denies the whole thing. This is definitely somebody who's acting in an immoral way. And the question is, what exactly has he violated, right? There's both withholding the pay and there's accepting a deposit and denying it, which is a separate prohibition. Now, the Gemara challenges this explanation. And as we continue here, because it is somewhat technical and we keep talking about transactions, deposits, formal acquisition, symbolic exchange, etc., we could get a little bit lost in the weeds on these terms. But what I would like us to remember is this. We all have unconscious bias, right? I think everyone is familiar with this term. And basically, it is human nature to interpret any kind of set of circumstances where there's some kind of a dispute or disagreement between yourself and another person. So you're going to interpret the facts in a way that's favorable to yourself, right? And the more clever we are, the more agile our brains are in interpreting the facts in a way that's favorable to ourselves. So the sages take this very seriously, and their source is obviously rooted in the Torah, where God spelled out, a sort of a core set of laws and really of underlying values from which the sages built up, many more interpretations and surrounding decrees to make a fence around the Torah. And what is it all about? It's this idea that in our everyday interactions, in our everyday transactions, in the simplest things, going to the market, buying some eggs, doing a little bit of business with the neighbor or with a guy who comes to mow your lawn, every little transaction and interaction, especially if it involves money, is actually an opportunity for holiness. Is actually an opportunity to examine yourself, examine your motivations, and to make sure that you're being punctilious with your honesty, with your word, with your integrity, right? It's not that holiness is only having big transcendent moments. And it's not that holiness is just, when you're in prayer, rocking back and forth in the midst of prayer. right? Everyday interactions are another crucial arena for conducting yourself in a righteous and holy way. And you have to keep questioning, am I just seeing it my way so that I make sure I don't get ripped off? But am I being as careful to analyze whether I might be causing harm, whether I might be entering into this transaction in a way that is unfair to someone else? Am I being as careful about his rights and his view of our transaction as I am being careful about my view and my rights? I mean, who among us can really truthfully answer yes every time I'm being that careful and I'm examining this from both sides of the transaction with equal analysis and caution, right? We have to apply it that way. And that's why the Gemara teaches elsewhere that when we leave this world, the first question will be asked is, were you honest in your business dealings, right? I mean, it's the first question. That's pretty important, right? And the other one is, did you set aside times, regular times for Torah study? But I think first they ask you, were you honest in your business dealings? Because that comes up all the time and because everyone is so prone to only see it from their point of view. Another lesson here is, let's face it, we're all very proud of ourselves for the work that we do, the job that we did. I worked hard, so whatever I have, I earned it. And to some extent, that's true. Of course, that's true because we do our hishtadlus, right? We do our part. But anything that we have, any property, any money that comes our way is by the grace of God. It could have all turned out differently. We could be the pauper in the street. We could be facing terrible, terrible hard times right now. Maybe some people in this virtual classroom are facing terrible hard times right now. And the ones who aren't should be saying, thank God I'm not facing that right now. Right? So why is that? Because everything that comes our way is by the grace of God. And what that means is that any money that happens to be in our hands doesn't really belong to us. We're the caretakers of it. We're the custodian of it. This is another reason why tithing is so important. Any income that comes our way, 10% should go right into that separate bank account from which you're going to distribute to charitable causes. Right? Because the only reason that you're earning money is so that you can give to charity. And again, if you ask the average person who's not organized about tithing, how much did you give last year? They say, I gave a lot. I supported many causes. And if you really worked it out, did you give away 10% of your income? 10% is a lot. It's a lot of money, right? And most people will not give away 10% of their income unless they get very organized about it and make sure they give away 10%. The ideal way is as soon as something comes in, you transfer to that separate account, and that's your giving account, right? But if you just ask people how much are you giving away and they don't know, they will way, way overestimate what percentage of their income they're giving away because it suits them. That's just the way the mind works, right? So none of the money, none of the property that we have in our possession is really ours. It's all there by the grace of God. And therefore, all of it that comes our way is an opportunity to practice righteousness, care, holiness, and make sure that we conduct ourselves with the most integrity possible. And when we do that, we release sparks of holiness with every transaction. Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we continue. Now, the Gemara challenges this explanation. That is precisely the case of a deposit that is already mentioned in the verse. What novel element is introduced by this case? The Gemara explains there are two types of deposit: a standard deposit and the case where one deposits with a Baili an item that had previously belonged to the Baili. Right now, the Torah mentions that it's a big transgression. Someone who deposits property with a Baili, the Baili takes a note that it wasn't his, and then that it was not in his care, in his possession, and then it turns out that it was. Right now, if he admits it, okay, he's going to be able to make a teshuvah for that, and if he doesn't admit it, it's flat out robbery. Right? And so what are the penalties for that, etc.? But that's why this keeps coming up, the law of the deposit. And we're talking about deposits now, even though in this section of the Gemara, we've been talking more about transactions, because again, when did property enter the possession of another. It can either be through a transaction or through a deposit. Now the Gemara asks, if so, and that is the explanation of the verse, let the verse repeat the case of a pledge as well, and interpret it in a case where the lender took the item from him by pulling it into his possession, and then he deposited that item with the debtor. So the Gemara responds, if the verse had repeated the case of a pledge, it would be neither a refutation of nor a support for the opinion of Reish Lakish, as the cases could be explained otherwise. And now that the verse does not repeat the case of a pledge, it supports his opinion that one acquires movable property only by means of pulling it into his possession. We're looking at the law of deposits to test our understanding of whether money could affect a transaction or not. The general laws we've seen over and over again is you only have a transaction finalized when you pull the item into your possession, not when the money changes hands, because money does not affect acquisition. Only acquisition affects acquisition. So the Gemara asks, and does the verse not repeat the case of a pledge, but isn't it taught in a baraisa? Rabbi Shimon said, from where is it derived to apply that which is stated above in the first verse, cited from Leviticus, to the verse stated below, i.e. the second verse cited from Leviticus, right, where it did not repeat pledge. So why is that? I.e. the second verse cited from Leviticus. It is derived as it is written, or anything about which he has taken a false oath, Leviticus 5:24. And Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avu says that Rav says this clause serves to include this clause serves to include the case of a pledge in the requirement of return, teaching that even in the case where the debtor designated an item as collateral for a loan, the lender is obligated to return the item even though there was no pulling. And the Gemara rejects that contention. In any event, the verse did not repeat the case of a pledge explicitly, and one derives support for the opinion of Reish Lakish from that omission. So from where do we derive support for the opinion of Reish Lakish? From a baraisa. It is as it is taught. If one had consecrated money, okay, now again, we're going to be talking about a different nuance of when something has actually changed hands and how that relates to money. Okay, so it is taught in a baraisa. If one had consecrated money, right, so he said, this money, I'm going to donate it to the temple for the upkeep of the temple. That money has acquired sanctity. You cannot use it for yourself. Nobody else can use it for themselves. Anybody who uses money for their own needs, and that money had previously been consecrated, that person is now guilty of the transgression known as me'ila, or misappropriation of consecrated property. So what happened here? If one had consecrated money, and then he gave it to a bathhouse attendant as payment for the use of the bath, he is liable for misuse of consecrated property as soon as he pays him, even before he uses the bathhouse. Right now, this would lend support to the idea that when money changes hands, some kind of transaction has been effected. Because if you've committed the transgression of me'ila as soon as you hand the money over, but you didn't use the bathhouse, you just gave the money to the bathhouse attendant, but you didn't enter. So what difference does it make that you gave him the money? Why is that misappropriation? Why is that me'ila if money changing hands is not the effective action to trigger a transaction? As soon as he pays him, even before he uses the bathhouse. And Rav says one can infer that it is specifically with regard to one giving the consecrated money to a bathhouse attendant that he is liable immediately. As in that case, there is no lack of pulling, since he is paying for usage of the bathhouse, not for an item. In other words, as soon as you gave the money to the bathhouse attendant, you did receive something in return. What did you receive? The right to use the bathhouse. Doesn't matter you haven't entered or used the bathhouse yet. As soon as you handed over the money, you got access, right? You received access. So there was no lack of pulling because, in fact, you did receive what was paid for. And he is liable for misuse. there is no lack of pulling, since he is paying for the usage, not for an item. But one can infer that in cases involving other matters, where the one giving the consecrated money is acquiring an item, there is lack of pulling. And he is liable for misuse only once he pulls the item he is purchasing. So if you had consecrated money and you said, you know what, I'm going to buy a new pair of shoes with that, and you give that money to the seller of the shoes, at that point you have not yet committed me'ilah. You have not misappropriated that money because the money hasn't done anything. You handed it over to him, but it doesn't actually become me'ilah until you take the shoes. Right? Once you pull the shoes, once you acquire the shoes, then the transaction is effectuated and then you become guilty of me'ilah. So apparently, by Torah law, it is only by means of pulling an item into his possession, not through payment of money, that one acquires an item. That's the law that we've proven over and over again. This is yet another proof. Now the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa, if one had consecrated money and he gave it to a barber, he is liable for misuse of consecrated property immediately, as soon as he gives him the money. And in the case of a barber, doesn't he need to pull the haircut utensils in order for their transaction to be finalized? You didn't get the haircut. Maybe you paid for it. You have the right to get a haircut, but that's different than having access to the bathhouse, right? Why'd you become guilty of me'ilah as soon as you give money to the barber, even though you haven't had the haircut yet? Right? It should be similar to buying a pair of shoes, and you're not guilty of me'ilah until you take possession of the shoes. So the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a Gentile barber, a non-Jewish barber, who is not subject to the requirement of pulling, which applies only to Jews. As it is written, and if you sell to your fellow something that is sold. Everyone agrees that a transaction with non-Jews is finalized with the payment of money. And this makes sense. This is not some kind of, bias or discrimination. It's that Gentiles are not subject to Torah law. No one is applying Torah law in their society because they don't live by Torah law. The non-Jews have whatever civil codes and criminal codes are in effect in the place where they live. And by the way, if we're not in a place where Torah law is sovereign, then Dina de Malchusa Dina, right? We are bound by the laws of the land in which we live. We don't consider that Jews have a law apart, right? We have to obey the local laws. We're just also obligated in Torah laws. But the non-Jew is not obligated in those laws. And outside of Torah law, people would say that as soon as the seller receives the money, the deal is in place. And so we're not going to say to the Gentile barber, oh, no, you have to follow our laws. No, our laws say that only pulling affects the acquisition, or acquisition of the object itself affects the transaction, and money does not. That doesn't apply when a Jew is doing business with a non-Jew. So the Gemara comments, and this is also taught in a baraisa. If one had consecrated money and he gave it to a barber or to a sailor or to any craftsman, he is liable for misuse of consecrated property only once he pulls the item belonging to the worker. And the Gemara asks, these two baraisas are difficult as they contradict each other. The first baraisa states that if one had consecrated money and he gave it to the barber, he is liable for misuse of consecrated property as soon as he gives the money. And the second baraisa states that he is liable for misuse of consecrated property only once he pulls the item. And rather, must one not conclude from it that here, the law in the first baraisa is with regard to one who gives consecrated money to a Gentile barber, who is liable when he gives the money to the barber. And there, the law in the second baraisa is with regard to one who gives consecrated money to a Jewish barber, who is liable only once he pulls the item. And the Gemara affirms, learn from it, that this is the case. Now the Gemara comments, and so says Rav Nachman, in agreement with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. By Torah law, the giving of money affects acquisition of movable property, and it was the sages who decreed that no, only pulling the item affects the transaction. And the Gemara adds, and Levi examined his compendium of baraisas, and he discovered this baraisa. If one had a consecrated ma, which is a coin, and he gave it to a wholesaler, a wholesaler, as the first payment for a large quantity of produce, he is liable for misuse of consecrated property. And this baraisa describes a situation where the buyer did not pull the produce, and yet he is liable for misuse. So apparently, by Torah law, the giving of money does affect acquisition. But this baraisa is difficult according to Reish Lakish, and the Gemara answers Reish Lakish could have said to you, in accordance with whose opinion is this baraisa? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, not that of the majority who overruled Rabbi Shimon. Now we're on 48b. The Mishna teaches with regard to one who reneges on a transaction after the money was paid. Right? So since we've said over and over again, once the money changes hands, the deal has not been finalized, only when the buyer takes possession, once he formally acquires the thing that he is buying. Therefore, if the money has changed hands and the other item hasn't been pulled yet, the deal has not been finalized, presumably the parties could renege on the deal. But as we learned yesterday and the day before yesterday, the buyer cannot renege. He already handed over the money. The seller has control of the money. He doesn't need to hand it back. And the seller, though he can legally renege, the sages considered it immoral to renege in such a situation. He can renege because we've said that by rabbinic decree, they said until the property leaves the possession of the seller, it's still the property of the seller. That's a protection of the buyer. The corollary of that is that therefore the seller could renege on the deal. But if he does use that option to renege, the sages will curse him with the curse of the one who extracted payment from the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersion, and the Egyptians who enslaved and the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah will exact payment from the one who reneges on such a deal. It's a heavyweight curse. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that now. So the Mishnah teaches, with regard to one who reneges on a transaction after the money was paid, but the sages said, he who exacted payment from the people of the generation of the flood and from the generation of the dispersion will in the future exact payment from whoever does not stand by his word. It was stated that there is an Amoraic dispute, right? A dispute between the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara. Abaye said that we inform one who seeks to renege on a transaction, be aware that this is the punishment of one who does not stand by his word. And Rava said that we curse him with that statement, right? So understand the difference between Abaye says, we tell him, if you renege, you're going to be, you're going to subject yourself to punishment from the one above. But we're just informing him of that. Rava says we tell him, if you renege, we curse you with the curse that the one who exacted payment will exact payment from you. Much heavier language. And the Gemara elaborates, Abaye said that we inform him. As it is written, nor curse a ruler among your people. Exodus 22:27, from which it is derived that it is prohibited to curse a ruler or any other member of the Jewish people, that we may not curse each other. And Rava said that we curse him, and the prohibition against cursing your fellow is not a concern, as it is written, among your people, from which it is derived that the prohibition applies only with regard to one who performs an action befitting your people, not one who reneges on a transaction after the money is paid. Rava said, from where do I say this law? I learned it from the incident where buyers gave Rabbi Chia bar Yosef money to purchase salt from him. Ultimately, the price of salt increased, and Rabbi Chia bar Yosef sought to renege on the deal. And he came before Rabbi Yochanan to ask his opinion. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, go and give them the salt. And if not, accept upon yourself he who exacted payment. And if you say we merely inform him of this punishment, is Rabbi Chia bar Yosef one who must be informed? He knows the law. And the Gemara rejects this proof. Rather, what is the alternative? That we curse him? Would Rabbi Chia bar Yosef come to accept upon himself a curse of the sages? Rather, you've got the story all wrong. The details of the incident were different. It was a down payment that buyers gave Rabbi Chia bar Yosef. The money had not changed hands, just a down payment had been made. The money was paid merely to bolster the commitment to complete the transaction. but the money had not changed hands, certainly not the full purchase price. Rabbi Chiya bar Yosef held that the down payment affects acquisition of salt commensurate with its value. And therefore, he wanted to give them only that portion of the salt, the amount that they had given him as a down payment. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, the down payment affects acquisition of salt commensurate with the entire amount of the transaction. Hold yourself to the higher standard. You know that when they made that down payment, it was to secure the whole deal. You can't just say, I'm only going to pay you give you as much salt as the amount of your down payment, and I can go sell the rest of the salt to someone at a higher price. Sorry, Rabbi Chiya, you can't do that, is what Rabbi Yochanan said to him. It was stated that there is an Amoraic dispute with regard to a down payment. Rav says a down payment affects acquisition of merchandise commensurate only with its value, right? So the down payment, the only thing that they can be guaranteed of getting is the amount of produce equal to the down payment, not what the whole deal that they were contemplating. They're not guaranteed that. And Rabbi Yochanan says it affects acquisition of merchandise commensurate with the entire amount of the proposed transaction. And the Gemara raises an objection from a Baraisa with regard to one who gives a down payment to another and says to him, if I renege, my down payment is forfeited to you. And the other person says to him, if I renege, I will double your down payment for you. The conditions are in effect. In other words, we accept those conditions, it works. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef. And the Gemara comments, Rabbi Yosef conforms to his standard line of reasoning, as he says, a transaction with inconclusive consent, known as an asmachta, affects acquisition, even though it is a commitment that he undertook based on his certainty that he would never be forced to fulfill the condition. It is considered a full-fledged commitment. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is sufficient that the down payment affects acquisition of merchandise commensurate with the amount of the down payment. That's all you are guaranteed. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, in what cases this statement said, it is when the buyer said to the seller, my down payment will affect acquisition of the merchandise. But if one sold another a house or a field for 1,000 dinars, and the buyer paid him 500 dinars of that sum, he has acquired the entire house, and he returns the rest of the money to the seller even after several years have passed if the deal doesn't go through. And the Gemara asks, well, what? Is it not that the same is true with regard to movable property as well? And in a case where the agreement is unspecified, the buyer acquires the entire item, not merely commensurate with the down payment? And the Gemara rejects this comparison. No, with regard to movable property, in a case where the agreement is unspecified, the buyer does not acquire the entire item. In other words, they didn't specify what would happen if the deal fell apart. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is movable property different from land? And the Gemara explains, in the case of land, with which the payment of money, one genuinely acquires it in a legal sense, the buyer acquires the entire tract of land with a down payment. In the case of movable property, with which the payment of money, one acquires it only in the sense that if he reneges, he will have to receive the curse, he who exacted payment, the buyer does not acquire the entire item with a down payment. So the Gemara suggests, let us say that this Amoraic dispute between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim. As it is taught in a Baraisa, with regard to one who lends money to another on the basis of collateral, and the sabbatical year commenced, even if the collateral is worth only half the sum of the loan, the sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan, like other loans that are canceled when the sabbatical year comes. And this is the statement of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, Rebbe says, if the value of the collateral was commensurate with the sum of his loan, the sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan. But if it was not commensurate with the sum of his loan, then the sabbatical year does abrogate the loan. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of this statement, the sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan, that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying? Aren't all loans canceled? Are you saying, well, no, actually, if there was collateral that already changed hands, it doesn't abrogate the loan. This would seem to be a different device for getting around the fact that the sabbatical year cancels loans. In the normal course of things, where they made the pro spool, right, where they would say so that the sabbatical year wouldn't cancel the loan, they would basically transfer the right to collect the debt to a court. And obligations to a court are not canceled by the sabbatical year. And this was an important device so that poor people could borrow money even as the sabbatical year was approaching. Wait a minute. So what is the meaning of this statement? The sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was saying. If we say it means that the sabbatical year does not cancel that part of the loan commensurate with the collateral, but it does cancel the rest, this indicates by inference that Rebbe holds that the sabbatical year also abrogates that half as well. And that is difficult is there not collateral commensurate with that half? Now we're on 49a, getting a little bit of a head start on tomorrow, but I'm almost done. So questions or comments, please get them in. So if that half is canceled as well, then why does he need the collateral that he is holding? The lender clearly took the collateral to enable him to collect at least part of his debt after the sabbatical year. Rather, do we not conclude from it, what is the meaning of the statement, the sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying? It means that the sabbatical year does not abrogate the entire loan. And what is the meaning of the sabbatical year abrogates the loan that Rebbe is saying? It is referring to the half of the loan that he did not take on the basis of collateral, which normally would be canceled. And they disagree with regard to this, as Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that a down payment affects acquisition of merchandise commensurate with the entire amount of the transaction, and Rebbe holds that a down payment affects acquisition of merchandise commensurate only with its value, the down payment's value. So apparently the Amoraic dispute parallels the dispute between the Tanaim of the Mishna, and the Gemara rejects this parallel. No! What is the meaning of the statement, the sabbatical year does not abrogate the loan, that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying? It is referring to that half of the loan that he took on the basis of collateral. And this indicates by inference that Rebbe holds the sabbatical year also abrogates that half of the loan that he took on the basis of collateral. And the Gemara asks, then why does he need the collateral that he is holding? And the Gemara answers, he requires it as a mere reminder to increase the likelihood that the loan will be repaid, and it does not prevent cancellation of the loan. And what is the law? The sabbatical year does not abrogate the part of a loan commensurate with the collateral. Some authorities rule that it does not abrogate any portion of the loan if there is collateral. And the dispute is whether the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel or that of Rebbe. That's where we're going to knock off for today. And God willing, we'll continue tomorrow, which should be the last day of this special time. Again, 7:30 p.m. Pacific tomorrow night. All right, let me take some questions. Okay. Questions. Okay, just seems to be one from Joe. When there are multiple incidents that each warrant adjudication, are individual judgments rendered, or do they all add up for one sentence being rendered? That's a great question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. But I think that in a rabbinic court, just like civil court, secular court, there are different causes of action, and those are going to be matters that are each tried, according according to the law for that matter. Now they might then, sort of resolve each of the different questions that are being litigated and sort of come up with there might be offsetting penalties, offsetting sums, etc. But if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would say that you can separate actions, and they're definitely, there's not necessarily going to be, one legal precedent that's going to cover all the different questions that are being asked, and they're going to address each of the questions separately. I suspect I'm not understanding the question properly, so I'm sorry, I'm probably not giving a good answer. And Michael says, what time every day after? Yeah, the normal time for us is 6 p.m. Pacific. every Sunday through Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific, Fridays at noon Pacific, and Saturday night after Shabbos ends in LA, which is getting later and later. So, I've been getting on the air at about 9 p.m. Pacific. It's sometimes even later. I mean, it's tough because Shabbos, it's going to end later and later. The latest will be around June 21st, first day of summer. But I try to get on the air, as close as possible to the end of Shabbos. Usually, about 40 to 60 minutes after Shabbos ends is when I can get on the air on Saturday nights. That's what I've got for us today. And for those who are wondering, this shirt is a reference to Spinal Tap. This one goes to 11. Goes to 11. Okay, my friends. God willing, see you tomorrow night.